we know that there are certain things that increase the likelihood of one winning a fight.
Mm-hmm.
What are those things?
So the main thing, and this is generally what we talk about when I give this talk, the main thing is what I call aliveness. And what works, when I first started martial arts when I was a kid, what I was obsessed with was what works and what doesn't work in an actual fight. And make a long story short, the martial arts that work, the functional martial arts, all have one thing in common, which is they all tend to be combat sports. So boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, Sambo, these are all combat sports in addition to being martial arts. And because they're combat sports, the consequences of training matter. They wanted to win. You want to be able to compete. You have to actually be able to physically do what you claim to do. If you're, for example, going to compete in judo, you have to actually be able to throw people and not get thrown, unlike Aikido, where it's all make-believe. And so with that sport basis, they have a form of competition and they have a live training where you're working with resisting opponents, you're working with training partners who are going to give you realistic energy, and you build on that over time, and you can learn how to fight. And all functional martial arts have that in common, and all fantasy-based martial arts, make-believe martial arts, which, as you mentioned, is a huge percentage. The superstition in the martial arts is massive. They all have in common a lack of that very thing, a lack of aliveness. And instead of working with resisting opponents and building with adaptive resistance, it's memorizing dead patterns and choreography, basically. So where one person pretends to attack and the other person then pretends to counter. And so the distinction is aliveness. And that's also where martial arts and what you do in critical thinking meet up, because in that sense, what matters more than the answer is how you arrived at that answer. And what matters more here is the training method that the athletes are using. And if they're training in a functional way, then ultimately they're going to come out on the other end with something that looks somewhat similar to modern mixed martial arts.
Let's do a quick review of base. So when Liam balls up, if we were doing jiu-jitsu, he's worried about I'm going to attack him. He's going to get his elbows in tight and everything like that. That makes it harder for me to attack, but that gives him less base on the ground, right? Especially if we draw an X from shoulder to hip, and we remember those angles, and I apply pressure at this angle, he becomes fairly easy to turn over. Once his hip goes past his ankle at this angle right here, I'm going to get a turnover. But he's doing that because he doesn't want me to jump on him and get hooks, obviously. But if we just focus solely on base, he's not worried about me attacking him, then he's going to want a wide base with his frames. And what you're going to see here, his frames go out past the silhouette of his body. We'll call this silhouette theory. This is from Coach Frankel. And the further his frames go from his silhouette, generally the more base he's going to have. And you'll notice where his posts are. His posts are at those angles, right? So the skinny X right here is blocked. I can't get his hip past his ankle because his ankle's over here. I can't get his shoulder past his wrist because his wrist is over here. So that's good base. So he's hard. If the game was just try and push or pull him over, he's much harder to deal with here than when he's balled up, right? Okay. So understand how that works. So if you look here, when I step like I would for boxing, my feet are almost within the silhouette of my shoulders, right? Especially if you're an athlete and have bigger shoulders. You can see, so if I look at Liam stand here, and he just takes a normal step, has his hands up like he's boxing, see his feet are almost within the silhouette. Look at that line right there. And what that means is he's easier for me to push and pull off to the side. So when we step, when we're grappling in the clinch, we're stepping out. When I step back, I'm stepping out. And what's important is my feet are outside the silhouette of my shoulders, okay? And I'm gonna rotate that foot out a little bit. Hickson talks about it as a box. If you look at the lines on the mat, this foot's here, it's almost a perfect box, and then I'm here, okay? So now when Liam takes that posture, you can just see if you look, here's the silhouette of his body. His posts are outside the silhouette. He's much harder to move that way. And when we're talking about clinch, we're talking about grabbing each other and pushing each other offline and affecting each other's base. That's the name of the game. So you're gonna wanna stand like this. So the first thing is just practicing that. We no longer wanna be stepping. Second thing is your hips, Okay, so when I step like this, if my hips go parallel like this, or diagonal, again, my base is off. Think about every sport where they're trying to knock each other back. Football, sumo. Sumo immediately comes to mind. Sumo is the ultimate sport about base, right? When they line up, their hips are always facing each other, whether we're talking about football on a three-point stance on the line or sumo. So when I'm stepping forward diagonally or back diagonally, I want to keep my hips forward. Always like this, right? Howder calls it like, I think he called it like radar, a radar dish or whatever. But your hips are this way, not here, okay? So my base is much weaker here than here. As soon as I make that adjustment, I have better base. So now Liam steps, but he keeps his hips forward. Good. This is much better.
I didn't start the sport till I was 33, almost 34. Half of my career was my 40s. I fought from till I was 47. I fought for 14 years. And I think because I had still been competing at a high level on the national team in Greco and in wrestling, going to the nationals, going to the trials every single year, going through camps, national team camps and stuff, my fitness level was still very high and I was still competing at a high level on the wrestling mat. So when I transitioned to MMA and juggled both of those balls for a while, I think it allowed me some longevity that maybe if I was an athlete that wasn't in that high or, good a shape, I might not have been able to go as long as I went, honestly. It's so hard to say. There's so many variables. Genetics plays a role. I think I've been very fortunate. I haven't had any serious injuries that took me out for very long. The knees held up. Most of the joints held up. And that's what I see. Guys get hurt.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing I see is this big upswing and downswing. They train, they peak for a fight, and then they celebrate and don't train for 3-4 weeks. And there's this big dip. And then they get another fight. So now they're back on the training journey. And it's that big lull in the bottom when now they're trying to get their body back in shape so they can get back up to fight shape to go compete, where I see these injuries start occurring. Yeah. They're putting a lot of stress on their bodies because they're not maintaining a more constant level, fitness level, when they're not staring a fight in the face. And I just love to train so much. It was a blast being in the gym, especially learning jiu-jitsu and learning Muay Thai and all this other stuff that I'd never done. I felt like a kid in a candy store. I couldn't wait to get back on the mat. And I think that regularity, I was older, so I didn't need to go out and party or celebrate or any, I was already with the people that I cared about and that cared about me. A lot of that went away when I was in my 20s. And I look back and think, man, imagine what I might have accomplished in a sooner time frame had I not been celebrating as much as I was in my early 20s up through my mid 20s. Maybe if I'd have been more dedicated in those in-between times, I would have peaked and accomplished some things earlier in my career. But I did it the way I did it, and I can see recognize the difference between the two states of mind. When, in my 30s, I was very focused. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Chasing girls, going to the clubs or partying wasn't part of that at all. So I think, you can't burn the candle at both ends. You stay focused, burn it as hot as you can burn it on one end and let the rest of that stuff go. Keep your fitness level high, even in between fights. That's when you learn new skills and put yourself in new situations, not when you're getting ready to fight somebody, but in those in-between times when you don't have an opponent staring you in the face. I think that's when you make your most growth, have the most fun, try the most new things you can try, and try to make them yours and implement them into your style, who you are. I think I'm glad and fortunate that I didn't get into this sport till I was 33, almost 34. I was an adult. I was settled in who I am and what I wanted and what my goals were. And none of the other stuff got in the way. And I think if I'd have tried to do this in my late teens or early 20s, it might have been a different deal. I might have been distracted by the fame, by a bunch of the other crap that kind of comes with this public world.
Let me show you a couple details here. Go back where you just were. If you get a leg flatten in the middle, go ahead. Yes. But your kneecap, right kneecap is pointed up. There's a little bit of space there where Ray can build a wedge. And he gets his foot underneath the knee. If he can touch his toes, there's no more elbow knee escape. Now you're going to have to use the power shrimp the way I showed you, okay? So if you turn your toes down into the mat, look what happens. Don't even bring your knee up. Straighten it out a little more. Just turn him down into the mat. When he turns his toes down into the mat, try and get your foot under, it takes away that space. So you're pressing your leg into the mat so he doesn't get any wedges. Then you slide the knee up, and see he's getting more and more compromised there. And then you curl your body up so you have more leverage, and then you just use the elbow and slip it underneath. From here, what I really want you to do is never stop. Students will go this far and they'll stop. I want you to go all the way to close guard. So continue the motion until you lock your guard up completely. And the reason for that is he's never going to stop once he starts to do that, and just let him do the technique. You're going to start passing. And everything you need to learn to defend against person passing when you're doing the elbow knee escape, you will learn if you go all the way to close guard. Right? Because the process of you going to close guard shuts down his passes. So watch this. We'll go back, and as Coach Travis starts to escape, I'm going to ask Coach Ray to start trying to pass the guard again, and I just want him to focus on getting close guard. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, good. So whatever he's doing on top, you're going to be able to work that counter by having that consistent motion. So go all the way from the beginning, all the way to the end to close guard. Now I'll show the same video. Once you practice that, go back. We can go ahead and start fishing with the feet.
Compared to how you trained when you were fighting and how you train athletes now, how do you get them working and wrestling safely so they're not getting injured?
So a lot of it's about knowing your training partners, and you know, I call it almost helpful resistance, right? Like, so Adam's going to body lock me and take me down. I know that. I'm going to feed him my hips a little bit. I'm not going to make it ridiculous, but you know, I defend the takedown enough just to protect myself. And then I might even, what I'm notoriously bad about doing is, as you take me down, I'll kind of turn a little different than you think a guy would, instead of fighting it to protect myself. The other thing here is I like to go, you know, everybody, drilling shouldn't be a problem. So I like to drill a couple minutes and then live a couple minutes, and then drill a couple minutes and then live a couple minutes, where we're going cooperatively. And then we're, you know, the other thing, like I would get, and when we started Adam, we would do like 20 minutes of learning, 30 minutes of rolling, right? So it was more broken up. Where I think now what we try to do is never stop moving for more than a couple minutes, so you don't cool down and then go again. You remember the old, like when we go to the Brazilian practice, it was like learn 3 moves and roll, you know?
We never did that. Yeah, what you're talking about now, I call dead alive. So I will take the new skill or the dangerous skill, and I'll make that part of the drill dead, so that the person knows how to fall properly. The person doesn't do anything stupid or invent something stupid, which is what athletes love to do. And then when it hits the area where they're comfortable or safe, then it goes live. So if you're working that takedown with me, I'm giving you some energy, some balance, but I'm not doing anything stupid. As soon as we hit the ground, now we're safe, and now this is where I really have to get up. Then I'll give it that real go.
Yeah, and that's where you see it a lot. Like, I'm going to punch, set up the takedown, I'm going to punch into it. The second your hip or back hits, boom, you're scrambling up and we're going live. Or what I like to do even more than that is the 70-30 drill. So I'm going to go 70% live, touch, 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 put you on the ground. As soon as we hit the ground, now you're going 70% live and I'm going 30%. And now I'm your drilling as you get up, or vice versa, however you want to start the drill, right? You had a lot of it, and I've forgotten it.
Well, it just depends on what skills you want to bring out and whose skills you're trying to work on at that point. Because if not, it just degenerates into sparring.
Well, the other thing I get a lot of people doing is where you will go all out, like you do your 3 rounds of actual sparring. Then you will continue to do some skill work, high intensity exploding, like on the mitts. And then you'll turn for 10, 15 seconds, right? And just defend a punch from a live person punching at you. Now, you may know what they're going to throw. You may not. You know, again, the constraints, how many variables you want to add, is going to depend on their training age, etc. But, right, so a lot of times, you know, so I want you to punch that max explosion And then I want you to defend, and hey, you can only defend with the jab and the teep kick. Do that for 20 to 30 seconds, back on the mats. It's the same thing we always did positionally, like with the get-ups to the, I guess I call it Shark Tank. A lot of people call a lot of things Shark Tank, but where you would basically be on half side, you'd be going live. I'd get up, I'd have to get to the mitts. I'd go half guard bottom again. I'd have to escape, get up to, those are for your high intensity days though.
Yeah, well, but also one of the easiest ways you can get someone to realize that they're not in MMA shape is to make them get up and down.
Yeah.
Take anyone and do 5 minutes of hard grappling, then get up and do boxing, and then vice versa. And they realize that everything is now changed. And if we can do that with on the cage and then box, and then on the ground and on the cage, and then if we can mix up, we can really screw up, for lack of a better term, their energy systems and really get them to figure out where they may have issues.
Chris, if I'm like this, I'm gonna go here, and you're sitting right there. I'm gonna put it like this, and I were to hammer down on that stick, what's gonna happen?
It's gonna come fly in my face.
Right. So if you were gonna hammer down on that stick and we wanted to break it right here, what would I need to do?
Hammer on both sides.
Okay, or hold it on one end, right?
Yes.
Because to the degree that I'm holding this end and you start to push that one down, if I'm weak here, but if I'm holding this with at least as much force as you push that down, then we can break it here, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing about footlocks. Okay, so everybody thinks like if this is the guy's foot and I'm attacking the footlock, people focus a lot on the entry, they focus a lot on the grip and all the stuff that's going on down here, but this other end of the stick is free to move and travel about. And if this other person has any idea what they're doing, they're gonna counter your footlock easy. So I'd rather you have one footlock that you're really, really good at, and what determines being really, really good? Well, controlling the position, which means controlling their hip with your feet. So people who are really, really good at footlocks, by definition, are really, really good at controlling the other end of the stick. They're good at controlling the other guy's body, in particular his hips, with their legs. And then what you're doing is you're isolating one limb with two. So I've got Liam's leg or Chris's leg. I've got one leg and I've got my two legs and my arms against that one limb. And all they've got is that leg, right? Because they can't get any closer to me, they can't move. And that's what defines a good footlock. I'm gonna show a basic footlock. I'm gonna play a game that I used to do many years ago. So I'm gonna give him a foot and I'm gonna take a foot, okay? So you can grab my foot. Okay. And I'm not gonna give him too much instruction right now other than to say, grab with kind of a guillotine grip, right? So I'm kind of just above his heel and I have a good guillotine grip. And what we'll do is we'll do a race from here, right? So when I say go, you can slowly try and put that footlock on my foot, okay? Go. Good. So that's a cheating game that we can do over and over again. But here's the thing that's completely relieving the pressure, even if Liam goes fast, is he's not controlling the other end of the stick, neither am I, right? But as he goes to apply that footlock, all I really need to do is keep moving my hips, see? And I'm eventually just gonna be on top of him, so he can't get any leverage. Meanwhile, I'm focused more on the grip here. Yeah, see? Even when I have a really good grip, you scoot your hips, I can't get it, okay? So that's not a game I advise you play. I'm just showing you that because it shows how important hip control is, okay? Now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna teach the fundamental footlock, the really old school one, which is the one David hit me with, okay? So with my grip, you see that little spot where his Achilles tendon meets his heel? That's really where I wanna be. And I'm gonna kind of catch it like that, so go to pull your foot out this way. Your heel is trapped and you can't pull your foot out that way, okay? And then just like with a guillotine or an overhook, I want my hand up high here. Some guys will lock this figure four grip, and this figure four grip is very powerful. You can look at Dean Lister and Hieron Gracie, other people who are good at footlocks. We use that figure four. But for now, I'm gonna keep it simple. So I'm thumb up, basically like a guillotine, and sometimes I might even make a fist here, okay? Now, assuming Liam's hips don't move, so you just stay there real slow, what I'm doing then is I'm pitching my elbow down to lock it in, like that, okay? And then I'm slowly laying back so that I'm pulling his toes back as I pull up here, and what I'm doing is I'm breaking the ankle here, okay? So again, I'm doing an external rotation with my arms, so my shoulders pull back, and my whole body, right? I'm leaning back. It's my whole core that's breaking Liam's foot. It's not me here like squeezing. Just like good jiu-jitsu, this part locks in, and it's your body that does the work. Now, having said all that, he's just going to jump on top of me here because I don't have any control over his hips. So what do I do with my feet? And this isn't a footlock I use very often because I'm tall, but that doesn't mean it's not solid. The simplest and easiest thing to do here is just put your feet on his body, okay? And the first thing he's going to try and do is push it off to clear it, right? But assuming I get a good grip and he can't push it off, the other one's in his hip, I'm going to extend with my feet, and it doesn't give him much time to do anything but tap, okay? Now that's not going to be probably the most common one you're going to do because you're not going to probably hop into that one. It's a very classical old Japanese footlock. But it's still a good one to practice because it gives you the mechanics. Welcome again to Portland. You know, one thing you and I have talked a lot about is fundamentals, and people who follow SBG or on SBGU are probably tired of me hearing me talk about it, but the curriculum for SBG has always been about aliveness, and then the physical techniques, we're talking about fundamentals. And with jiu-jitsu, when we talk about fundamentals, we're talking about things that are efficient. Right. And we're looking for the most efficient option and universal, and you know, it's going to apply to self-defense, gi, and no gi. Right. But very often when I see instructors teach, even some of my own black belts, other jiu-jitsu coaches, so often it turns into a chain of movements. Sure. Which is, and very often it's that instructor's personal gain. Right. And I've tried hard over the years to steer people away from that. Sometimes it can be a little bit, depressing is not the right word, but a little bit frustrating. Right. That, you know, it seems to be rare. Like you're one of the few coaches, even within the organization, who sticks to just fundamentals. Right. Why is it such a hard thing to get across to people?
I don't know. It's hard for me even sometimes. Like today, filming the DVD was like tempting.
Tempting.
You're
to go
in the front
stuff.
headlock, and now it's like I can show you 17 cool submissions from here, and it's seductive because you want to show all the cool stuff you can do from a position. Yeah. But, and I've told you this before, it's like teaching at the university. I actually hinder my students by showing them my game. So just the university analogy is, it's my job as a professor of jiu-jitsu and a professor at the university to be doing my own cutting edge research. Right. But it's not my job to demand that my students try to learn that when what they really need is the fundamentals that are allowing me to do my cutting edge research. Right. And I need to give them what they need to do what I'm doing on a separate and parallel track, not to copy me. Right. And so it's hard because you're doing this research in jiu-jitsu or in academia, and you find it compelling, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. Right. It's what I think is both fun and effective and important. Right. But I don't want to force that onto anyone else, and I do them a disservice sometimes by forcing it onto them.
Right, that's a very good analogy, and I think that is a big part of it. I think part of it too is just that's how everybody teaches, right? Right. With very rare exceptions. So if you go to most classes, a lot of the students will have learned that way. Right. So it's almost a habit you have to unlearn. Yeah. So we've talked before, when we talk about fundamentals, we talk about jiu-jitsu. One thing I heard you say many times is that you're very picky with your jiu-jitsu. Yeah. And you and I have both been training quite a bit recently with Henry, who's also part of SBG. And part of that is that line of Hickson's jiu-jitsu that seems to be so efficient. Yes. And in so many ways, it's kind of personifies everything that we've talked about jiu-jitsu should be. Right. So talk to me a little bit about that. How do you think of Hickson's jiu-jitsu as being different from much of what we've seen or much of what you did in the past?
I think it is more efficient in a couple of ways, like really demonstrable ways. One that's obvious, regardless of what movements are being done, most of what he and Henry are teaching will have between 2 and 4 steps. So it's efficient in that way, both in terms of ease of learning and retention on the student's part, but also in the middle of a real fight, whether that's a fight with rules in a tournament or a self-defense situation, I think, you know, it's just demonstrably more difficult to recall a 17 step. I mean, just mentally to recall 17 steps in a row under pressure than it is 3 or 4. And even if you're a genius and you have total recall and muscle memory, it's inefficient in the sense that you can get through 13 steps, and if your opponent realizes what you're doing and stops you at 14 or 15, you just wasted a lot of time and energy.
Right.
So I think it's efficient on the front end in terms of learning and retention, and on the back end in terms of execution. And that's regardless of the movements. And then when I see the movements themselves, to me they're most economical, the most commonsensical, best weight distribution, best angle, things that a lot of other people don't have. I mean, there's not a lot of dependence on grips.
Yep. So
it translates well to no-gi and self-defense. It translates into not being injured all the time.
Yep.
Because you're not gripping all the time. It forces you to have better weight distribution and better angles and better posture because you're not relying on grips. And grips is it's one, the smallest, weakest bones and muscles in your body.
Right.
But it's also, even if those hold up, it's just a way of transferring into a kind of bodybuilding jiu-jitsu, right?
Right.
Whereas when you're not gripping so much, it's more on the top, weight distribution angle, and on the bottom, posture.
Right.
Right. Not I'm going to grab you and push you away, but I'm going to configure my body in such a way that I can transfer your energy through me into the ground.
Right.
So I just think no matter what angle I examine that jiu-jitsu from, to me it's the best. And we talked also in the car about people make a logical error by saying, but look at athlete A, he makes that game work. Or
Right.
look at athlete B, she makes that game work. And it's a different argument, right? They're confusing the argument. I didn't say certain people couldn't make it work. That's like the people who say, but my Aunt Betty smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day and drank 2 bottles of scotch and she lived till 100.
Yeah.
And it's like, but she might have lived till 130 and won 10 Olympic gold medals because she has such great genetics.
Right.
It's not an argument for that as proper nutrition, you know?
Sure. Once you've repeated the movement for 5 or 10 minutes and you know you can do it mechanically correct, after that we have to start adding some level of resistance. It has to be alive. That's the funnest part of training. But if you just do the technique for 5 or 10 minutes and then it's like, okay, let's roll, then you just go back to what you normally do when you roll, which is how a lot of people train. The most important part is the part that got skipped, is the drilling part in the I method, the isolation stage. That should be the majority of the time spent during a class. So you work the technique for 5 or 10 minutes, you can do it mechanically correct, and now for the next 40 minutes, we're gonna do rounds. One side, try and punch, one side, defend, and then roll, you know, for 5 or 10 minutes after that. But that's how you really start to develop the skill and spend time here. So adaptive resistance, if Ray's clobbering Travis, he's got to dial it back down so that Travis is learning something from it. If Travis is successful all the time, he's going to dial it up, okay? And we'll just watch and see what happens. And then, you know, 90% of the time, most all of us, myself included, tend to make similar mistakes from positions like this, which we can learn from, okay? Go ahead.
So we're starting from
Start there, and then Ray's going to stay mounted and try and touch your head with the gloves. Yep, you can climb if he gives it to you. Okay. And then you're going to try and escape, but UPA only. UPA only. I don't want to see any elbow knee escapes. Very nice. Right back to it. I don't want to spend 10 minutes of video showing you that, but just give you an idea of how you should drill. So find a training partner you like working with and set the timer for long rounds. That round should be at least 5 minutes. There's no point for like 2 or 3 minutes. It takes sometimes 3 or 4 minutes to figure out what the other person's doing. So you got to let your body have time to adapt. I like 5 or 10 minute rounds per side. So slow it down if you have to so you can do a longer round, and that way you can start to problem solve during the round. And the thing you notice there, the monkey paw works good. It's hard to climb. It's harder to climb than it looks on film when they're connected to your hips. And so the real secret to making that technique work is the fact that you got to keep hip connection with them the whole time. So Travis is keeping his hips up the whole time, staying connected to Ray. That means he can affect Ray's base, you know, instantly within a millisecond, and that's what makes this work. If you get lazy and you drop your hips back flat to the mat, it's not going to work out well. So you got to maintain that connection, and you got to spend time doing it. Nutrition for what we do, for combat athletes and for jiu-jitsu, and that's going to be kind of two parts. So there's the regular, like for me, everything I do, and I know for like John Frankel's the same and others, it's about sustainability, because I want to be able to roll with my grandkids when I'm 85.
Right.
So that's what I'm concerned about. And then for some of the younger athletes, they're thinking more in terms of pre-competition hydration and diet, and or when they're having the heavy workouts that are meant to mimic the competition, then they want to do the same thing, right? So attack that either however you want, but basically two related but different goals there.
Yeah, the two shouldn't be super far apart. Like the demands of a professional athlete clearly can become antagonistic towards a really longevity bias. Like there can be orthopedic issues and all kinds of things like that. But there is kind of a reality that, one of the big challenges, like something that was interesting for me as a coach, I never coached people in jiu-jitsu early on, but I would do their strength and conditioning as part of their MMA and stuff like that. But my main role as a coach for those folks was to act as a speed bump so they didn't totally destroy themselves on game day. Oftentimes, like the people willing to do MMA and really compete at high levels in wrestling and all that, they don't need a Jocko Willink like pep talk in the morning. Usually they need like a cold shower and like, dude, you got to calm down. Like you're going to be totally destroyed on game day. So, within all that context, they're pushing their body and their minds to the limit. And the kind of crazy suggestion that I make is that just generally nutritionally, they should have a minimally processed whole food based diet, kind of protein centric as a beginning. We figure out if the person does better on carbs or fat or a mix, and a little bit of tinkering will tell us that. And that's really where we go. And because, fighting is typically a weight class based sport, we try to keep body weight pretty close to what you're going to do. I mean, MMA is a little different because they get this, 24-hour plus period to rehydrate and do all that type of stuff. Even then, I would make the case that folks would really, it would likely increase the longevity of their career to stay closer to a competition weight than not. Like those really massive weight fluctuations are pretty rough, but stay reasonably close to fighting shape throughout the year. You don't need to be neurotic about it, but a fight camp should just kind of like hone things. It shouldn't be that we're taking you from the couch and completely trying to rebuild you from scratch. But big picture, the nutrition, minimally processed whole food type diet, I find some people do really well on higher carb, lower fat. Some people the exact opposite. The low carb stuff is interesting in the context of a combat sport because it really is a glycolytic sport. So it's very high intensity, but some people do okay with a lower carbohydrate intake on that. They find that they maintain a little bit better body composition. They don't get the blood sugar highs and lows that are kind of typified by a more a higher carb or a more refined carb diet.
Right.
But that's stuff that, if somebody's really taking their training seriously, this is something that you do in the really early pre-competition phases where you do some nutritional tinkering. You fiddle with those levers of protein, carbs, fat to kind of see where you feel good. And then the worst thing that somebody could do is really change something drastically as they get closer to game day, so like try to get a serial killer consistency around nutrition, sleep, restoration, like very, very consistent, understand what the feedback response is around all that. And then I guess you mentioned the hydration. Like, I think that is a piece that folks don't take nearly as seriously as they should. Just within ACSM guidelines, American Council of Sports Medicine guidelines, those folks, and this will depend on like a really large athlete versus a smaller athlete and whatnot, but their general recommendations are to consume at least 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day for an athlete that is training at high intensity, high temperature and or high humidity, which, grappling MMA, it's always hot. it's always humid, it's always high intensity. So I think that that is a major piece that folks are missing, is the electrolyte story, in particular sodium. Like, people think a lot about potassium and magnesium, and they are really important. But when we're physically active, when we sweat, we don't really excrete much potassium or magnesium. We excrete huge amounts of sodium. Some of the work that we've done with NHL players, these bigger guys will lose 10 pounds of water in a game or a hard training session, and 10 grams of sodium during that time. Yeah. And then going back to like standard of care, the standard medical advice is that people shouldn't consume more than 2 grams of sodium in a day. So you may have like a 5-fold deficiency in the amount of sodium that you need. And the symptoms of that: lethargy, brain fog, poor reaction time. And then cramping is when you are really far down the rabbit hole of being sodium depleted specifically. So if you're experiencing cramps, you've gone so far down the sodium depletion story that it honestly is dangerous. I mean, the kind of ultimate cramp that you can get is a heart cramp, and low sodium can play into that. So, you know, that's where the hydration piece, it was kind of cool. I got to go on Lance Armstrong's podcast, and he you know, very accomplished athlete, whatever else people think about, you know, the rest of his life. But he made the point that he doesn't view triathlon as a 4-sport endeavor or a 3-sport endeavor. He sees it as a 4-sport endeavor. And the fourth piece, the fourth sport, is nutrition and hydration. And he was emphatic about that. And I thought that that was a really remarkable insight, and not dissimilar from Greg Glassman, who's the founder of CrossFit, who in their pyramid, their hierarchy of what they want to develop, they had nutrition, you know, the molecular basis of our function, as the foundation. And then they got into different layers of the training from there.
He has good base and posture. In whichever way I see him leaning, remember, in this case, it's going to be left hand first. And if he goes over here, it's going to be right hand first. Okay. If he's in the center and I start going here and he starts moving his head off this way, I'm probably going to, I might even just let go like I did there, so I can attack here, because here he can't really tuck his chin, right? That was the focus of that video. And once I get on his neck, I know I can finish. And again, I want you to watch what little pressure it takes for me to finish here. It's not a lot. So blood chokes, you don't need to like squeeze hard. If you're having to squeeze really hard, your grip is wrong. Again, you want to go back and fix it. Head's over here. Yeah. I'm going to go this hand. If I was going left hand first and he starts shifting out that way, if I put my hand in here, tuck that chin, that's going to be an impossible choke to get, right? So I might just let it go, come here, and then get the second hand in here. And again, once I get it there, I don't need to go all the way to here. If I have to, right, if I have a really bad choke, then I can start to use my back. But boy, if you're using your back, your grip is off. Okay, so that's what we got in the last video. Here's the tricky part. Whichever hand I get in first, get good base and posture. This guy's not going to want to cooperate with me, right? He's not going to want to let me break him down. So how do we start breaking down the guard? I'm going to start to use my foot, okay? So I'm going to get a foot on the hip. So as soon as I get a left foot on the hip, now I have two things. I can use my foot and my arm for leverage to bring him down, but also he may want to grab this leg or start to put pressure on it down. And that opens up the space for my hand to come in. Now the over choke tends to be a lot easier to get. It's a little, I think, less powerful, but it's a lot easier to get because I don't have to fish my second hand inside there. All I have to do is reach over the top and then I can finish here. Now the thing to remember with this choke is what I feel does most of the work is still my right hand, okay? So I get this first grip in here. This second one, I grab what I can grab, and on his gi, I don't know if you guys can see that for the camera, but there's usually a fold, like especially when I'm pulling down on his gi here, it'll bunch up at the top. And if so, I'll grab there. If I don't have that, I'll put my thumb in the gi. But more often than not, unless they've got a really tight gi on, I can grab some cloth here. That's all I need. Okay, so now what's the purpose of this hand? It's to keep him from tucking his chin and to create a frame where his neck can't move. So tuck your chin, Tuck your chin. See, I prying his head up with that hand, and now his neck is in one place. So as I apply leverage with my right wrist, he can't get away from it, okay? That's what this is for. So I'm coming in here, and that's one of the benefits. Go to tuck your chin. It's very difficult for him to get underneath. But watch. Same thing, if I'm over here, if he's over here, and I try, not only is it hard for me to get my hand in here, but tuck your chin there. Yeah, turn it a little more this way. See, now I can't get it at all. So here, move your head off. I might be inclined to switch grips. So I come underneath with my left hand and come over the top with my right.
There's a little bit of residual bitterness just because nobody knows, very few people know about catch wrestling or know about that history, even though it was, like you mentioned, it was such an important part of American culture.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes they get a little annoyed at all the attention going to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, which I can understand to a certain extent if I come from that background.
Well, let me say this. And a lot of my, quote, catch wrestling brothers might not like this. But the best martial art in the world, in my opinion, is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Okay, and it's not because you can beat someone up or this or that. It's because it truly is for everyone, and that you can do it for a long period of time. The catch wrestling, you don't see. I don't want to be Billy Robinson with the cane, walking around and just pointing. I've had a total of like 17 really procedures all over my body, neck, elbow. If you can see, I can't even. This is as much as I can straighten my arm. Okay, I've had so many elbow surgeries that I can't even straighten my arm. I have cervical stenosis. Any little twerk of my neck, I could be paralyzed. I've had 5 ACL knee injuries, 3 actual surgeries. But still, I can do jiu-jitsu. I can still do jiu-jitsu competitively.
Yeah.
I can. If I only had one arm, we have a blind person in our class. Okay, we have lots of women. We have big people, small people, older people, younger people. It truly is for everyone. And what the catch wrestlers, what they don't understand is that it's not sustainable.
Yeah,
it's not for everyone. You can make it that way, but matter of fact, the school that I belong to now, like I went through a lot of schools because they would open up back in the 90s. A week later, they were closed. A month later, they were closed. So I was going back and forth, and I came to the school, but right at the time, I was really getting to the heart of catch wrestling. So what I was doing is I retaught myself wrestling. I would go to clinics all over the United States, learning parterre wrestling on the ground. And so what I wanted to
Not to interrupt you real quick, but so parterre, when I learned it from Randy, was basically the part of Greco where you try and flip the guy over, right? You're talking about something.
Yeah, I'm talking. See, that's one of the weaknesses of freestyle wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
Their parterre is, I don't want to say it's simplistic. It's simply getting a gut wrench or getting a leg lace and just exposing the shoulders. That's it. And when people start going to freestyle and Greco, they lose that parterre from American folk style collegiate. We're the only people in the entire world that does folk style wrestling parterre on the mat. And some people say that we should get rid of it because all of a sudden we have these people in America who, they've been doing folk style and collegiate, and all of a sudden they go to freestyle competing with people who've been doing freestyle all their life. And Ben Askren said that folk style wrestling it's like a brother of jiu-jitsu. Mm-hmm. And it's so right. It's very, very similar. But like if you only train with a freestyle wrestler or Greco wrestler, they haven't really done folk style wrestling for years. And that's why in an interview with Randy Couture, he said that he had really forgotten about the power of the parterre wrestling because, again, he was so obsessed with the gut wrenching, the leg laces. On the bottom, you just flatten out like Superman. That's all you have to do. but more people are bringing a little bit about, you know, the half Nelsons, the reverse Nelsons. So before I went to the school that I sort of affiliate with now, I was, you know, really focused on trying to make modern real catch wrestling. So I would take legal moves and I would take them to the edge. And I was like, oh, this is a new school. I'm going to go there. I'm going to show these jiu-jitsu guys, you know, the power of real catch wrestling, not this shoot wrestling stuff. Problem was, I was hurting a lot of people. And these people were really nice. And I was like, you know what? For the first time, I got a good group of nice people. I'm not going to hurt them. I'm like, I just put the catch wrestling to the side. And I would rather be with a good group of people than try to, you know, do this thing that's going to hurt people. Because the thing with jiu-jitsu, I know everybody knows people get hurt in jiu-jitsu, but the things are not going like directly against like some of your joint, the cranks, the neck cranks.
Right.
You could still do it, but still, it just wasn't worth it to me.
So low mount, again, is Liam's laying forward on him, and he's got that prayer feet position, or his feet are crossed. And on low mount, your weight is on the person's body. I don't want your weight on the knees, okay? Middle mount, his weight goes to his knees. And he can be either low, down, upper body down on the mat. Yep, you can be low like this, or you can be up. But for my terminology, so you guys understand, both are middle mount. If he gets underneath Chris's arms and gets high, that's high mount. And if Chris turns on his side towards the camera and Liam shifts to side mount. Okay, so those are basically your variations of mount. We're going to focus a little bit from middle mount. Once you get comfortable with low mount, you start attacking well, you're going to find yourself here a lot. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to have Chris try and move around and escape a little bit, nice and relaxed, and I'm going to see how Liam is holding. Good. So let's break it down piece by piece. Go ahead and lay down for me, Chris. First thing I'm going to talk about is lower body, okay? So when I'm at middle mount, I don't want to be sitting on Chris as a general rule. I'm going to say as a general rule because there's going to be times when I sit back and attack that I am going to sit on him and give him my weight. As we go, you'll see that. But most of the time, I'm going to be like this. And so if I sit on him, push on my knees are pretty light, and he can move that. If I keep always pinching my knees together, even when he gets on his side and starts to push, my legs are heavy. See, so good. So one of the first things I do as he gets on his side is I'm continuing that pressure of my knees going together. So that buys me time. So that's what I'm doing with my lower body, with my knees. With my hips, I'm not sitting on them. I'm always off him a little bit. With my feet, I'm building wedges, okay? So every time a space appears, let's say he turns this way a little bit. Good, and you can see there's some space between, let's say I'm up here. There's space between his hip and the mat. My foot comes in and occupies that space like a wedge, okay? So now as my foot's in there, my knees are together, every time he moves, it just gets tighter, right? And this becomes a more and more of a trap. So your knees are pinched together, your feet are building wedges, and your feet can't do that ever if they're like this. Your feet should never be like this. So feet are always like this and working to touch. They're always trying to connect together. The stuff that we would emphasize the most, the stuff that I would emphasize the most, that I would wind up teaching the most of it in one way or another had come piecemeal through someone else from Rickson. So for example, the tuck in the tailbone inside the closed guard, that came from Chris Howder, but Chris got it from Rickson. That was from him training with Rickson. So I look back at all the pieces that I found to be really essential in terms of posture in one way or another seem to have come to us through someone else, but ultimately was Rickson's lineage, you know? Right. It's kind of funny. Right. So you're in a great position to explain this because you spent such a long time with training with Roberto and you've been through all the curriculum and the whole evolution with us. So when you're talking to someone else, let's say you're talking to a jiu-jitsu instructor who's not me, who has the kind of preconceived notion that you mentioned, that you articulated well a minute ago, where they think he was just a guy back then, but jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu, and if anything, it's evolved. How are you going to explain to that person what's different about Rickson's technique?
Right. So I think the important heuristic that we can have here, like a mental model, is the difference between first principles and reasoning by analogy. So interesting, like for anybody that wants to just do a quick YouTube search, type in like Elon Musk first principles, and you'll see a couple videos pop up that are very short. And, you know, he's pretty much the kind of the perfect example of a public, you know, figure. He's always toggling between first and second, with Bezos as the richest guy in the world. But, you know, he's an engineer first and foremost, and kind of an entrepreneur second. And, you know, everything he's done has been, he's always come in as an outsider. He's always been disruptive. He's obviously brilliant. He's a genius, but he's a first principles thinker. And he's the first person, even as highly intelligent as he is, to talk about how difficult that is to do. But my argument is always, it's very hard to do everywhere, even if you're intelligent. But if you are really invested in some particular area, you know, a few areas in our life where we devote most of our time and attention, it's fucking worth it. So reasoning by analogy, sort of the blanket logical fallacy way of saying like what the crowd's doing, kind of passing on conventional wisdom, status quo sensibilities, modeling on the norm. And first principles really is what I think kind of retrospectively SBG's always been very good at being in the process of, is stripping away the assumptions and kind of going down to the very basement, you know, foundational level. And once you've gotten down to the most essential components of whatever the question is or the problem is, you build up from there, right? And so like now you hear people who are, you know, in the spotlight, you know, there's a bit of reasoning from authority that goes on here, but you hear somebody who's a brilliant trainer like John Danaher and everything, saying not even something reasoning by analogy close to what we were saying about methodology, right? But essentially saying the exact same shit we were saying, but only now do people go, whoa, you know? And, you know, so it's just, that's the nature of the beast. You have to understand it. But the thing about Hickson is, so the thing to kind of pull out of this historical figure and all of this shit is Hickson was probably the greatest first principles thinker that we've ever had in jiu-jitsu. And I would argue nobody thinks about him as an innovator. I would argue he's probably our greatest example of an innovator in jiu-jitsu for this reason. It was on your podcast with him when he was in Portland for that seminar. I think I talked about this the last time I was with you, but it was on that podcast that he said what I think is like the most badass thing I've ever heard, which I'm not going to get this exactly right, but to paraphrase, he's like, there's a lot of people out there like world-class, top of the food chain athletes and stuff that have amazing technique. But what I realized is that it's based on still like a partial connection. But he's like, you know, I was never the slowest guy or the weakest guy. I always had a pretty good body and I could make it work, you know, athletically. But what about jiu-jitsu for the people that will never have that and aren't that level an athlete? What I really wanted to do was find the kind of follow my dad, Elio, and like get the best expression of jiu-jitsu. So what I did was I went through all the positions, all the techniques, and I discovered the full connection. Right? And I think it's so easy for people to just fucking breeze over that statement, like, yeah, whatever. And it's like, no, you realize what a monumental thing that is. Mm-hmm. And then you realize why, because we've had all these stories like validated, if you want to put it in context, right? Yeah, now he's, whatever, is he 60 or something like that? I don't know. But at the time that he was like 40 and already had, you know, really bad back and a couple other injuries, right? And he had the people that were the best at the time coming into his academy when he was only insulated, training with his own students. Very few of them were even black belts, right? And these world-class guys would come in that were basically training as professional athletes for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And he would just adapt to their movements and shut down games that he had never encountered before.
Yeah.
You know, and I think one of the best expressions of what we're talking about is the story about one particular very well-known world champion who was credited as kind of being the best guy with the spider guard, like an innovator of the spider guard. And as the story goes, Henry was there in person, corroborated this, that he was giving Rickson a hell of a time. Rickson couldn't pass his guard because every time, all of a sudden, a little rotation, the foot pummels back in and he's caught up in the web again. So it wasn't that he was actually threatened about being submitted, but he just couldn't pass, and you could see everybody's like, he visibly frustrated. So he went home and grabbed Rickson, who I believe was 12 at the time. And as Henry always says, this is so critical, like he solved the problem, never technique for technique. It was never like, I need to have a new game to answer this problem. It was always movement for movement on the most first principles fundamental level.
Yeah.
And then his theory was, right, if I could get my 12-year-old son to be able to then do it on me after I've worked it out on him, and I'm an adult and I'm a big, strong Rickson or whatever, like then I can do it to anybody. So then he went in the next day and he would just walk through this guy's guard, and the spider guard was never a problem. And I'll just say one more thing about this, because I think it's relevant. It's kind of been something that's been a really part of my thinking recently, is that kind of tied into the first principles approach, which will, transcend whatever historical period that Rickson was taking place in, right? It was what he was able to do, is this concept of anti-fragile. So this, I think, was a huge contribution for, like, we could think about this in the context of the SBG tree, right? And anti-fragile or anti-fragility is a concept that comes from Nassim Taleb. And basically what it means, he's talking more generally about, markets, and then how to basically have an anti-fragile infrastructure when at any time you could have like a black swan event, like a pandemic or a market crash or something come. And so his observation in a very simplified, kind of reductive form, is that there's a difference between a robust system or a robust company or whatever, right? A robust approach and a truly anti-fragile approach, because the key quality of anti-fragility is that when you have outside stressors, right, some sort of stimulus that will be potentially devastating to even a robust system, an anti-fragile system actually assimilates that and becomes stronger. And I always kind of use the analogy of the Ang Lee Hulk in that movie, because whenever you shot him, he would get angrier and then he'd actually get bigger and more jacked. And so it's kind of like anti-fragile. And so tying that into what we're talking about, I think Rickson's genius is, Henry said, if you could, he wasn't always the best explaining it, but if he could come in and feel it, he was the best instructor in the world, because he had such an amazing sensibility about movement for movement, the human body, and figuring out those connections. He could problem solve anything very quickly and then have a solution to shut it down. It was like his genius. So connection is really the anti-fragile thing, right? That's the thing that takes what I think we always had in SBG with our methodology and the prioritization of posture and pressure and everything. And then you add the connection to it. Like now you're talking about a truly anti-fragile system, because it's not to say like any of us that are, 40, 50-year-old instructors or something, oh, I understand, connection on a pretty decent level. So I'm going to take, the best guy in the world and I'm going to solve all the problems he presents. That's not what we're talking about. But on a level that anybody could achieve, right, that would be the guy. That would be the highest expression of efficiency.